And welcome to day 3 of Building Nations. So far, we've heard from several cabinet ministers throughout the course of the conference. But today, we're going to start hearing from the opposition, starting with an opposition address from Andrew Bailey, the National Party Infrastructure Spokesperson and Shadow Treasurer Revenue. Later on, we're going to hear from opposition MPs in a political panel with Fran O'Sullivan. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Andrew. So Andrew is the National Party Member of Parliament for Port Waikato, and he was elected in Henua in 2014. Andrew holds the portfolios of Shadow Treasurer, Revenue, Infrastructure and Statistics. And prior to the 2020 election, Andrew has been spokesperson for Revenue, Commerce, State-owned enterprises, small business and manufacturing, and associate spokesperson for Finance. He has been a member of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee since his election to Parliament in 2014. He's a trained accountant, and Andrew has worked with merchant banks in New Zealand and London before co-founding Cranley, a merchant bank which has offices in New Zealand, Australia and latterly Singapore. With teams working in infrastructure, health, property, agriculture and food, Cranley offered advisory and capital markets advice to a range of government entities, local authorities and corporate clients. Formerly an officer in the New Zealand Territorial Army and British Parachute TA Regiment, Andrew has a long career in endurance events. His mountaineering ascents include Araki Mount Cook and Mount Aspiring in New Zealand and 4 mountains in Antarctica. Andrew graduated from Massey University. He's a chartered accountant and a fellow of the former New Zealand Institute of Management and fellow of Governance New Zealand, a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Corporate Management and a UK Chartered Association of Certified Accountants. He's also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in London. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. Hey, well, kia ora koutou katoa, ko Andrew Bailey ahau no Wanganui ahau. Hey, it's an absolute pleasure to be joining you today. Hey, first of all, I'd like to say that the role of infrastructure is something I've always been involved in my merchant banking days, and it's a role that I'm very pleased to have within the National Party alongside the role of Shadow Treasurer. Having come from the private sector, I've got a bit of experience around how infrastructure projects work, and I'm looking forward to using this in the role that I have. The first thing I'd like to say is I do not accept the proposition that as New Zealanders, we have to put up with substandard infrastructure. We are simply not delivering infrastructure projects in a timely manner, and they're costing more than they ought to. As a result, our lives are worse off. We have wonderful engineers, willing construction companies, and the means to fund big new projects in New Zealand. What we need to do is that we need to join up the disparate institutional arrangements we have and deliver what is required. The simple fact is, however, that we have an infrastructure deficit. This is both at a central and local government level. As the Infrastructure Commission notes in its report, excluding the cost of electricity and telecommunications infrastructure, we should be investing about 31 billion a year in each of the next 30 years, which is currently about double the rate of investment in New Zealand. This future investment needs to encompass both hard infrastructure, and we know that means road, rail, and water and wastewater, but also soft infrastructure such as educational, health and community facilities. From a government's perspective, we also undertake investments in the prisons or the corrections area, defence, and just as importantly, digital connectivity. In a post-COVID world, investment in infrastructure can play a key role in helping to drive economic activity. It means that it is particularly important that this investment is also made at a regional level. Smart infrastructure investment can also play an important role in decarbonising our economy. This is important and a necessary step, and I was just listening to the previous session on that. The effects of climate change on future infrastructure is also significant. NIWA estimate that there will be about 125,000 buildings that would be affected if we had a sea rise of up to a metre, and their replacement cost is about 38 billion. However, in New Zealand, we have limited capacity to do multiple projects at once. This constraint means that central and local government should be clear about their plans and ensure a continuous pipeline of works exists for major contractors so they can resource accordingly. Because we do not do this effectively in laying out our pipeline, we're missing out on significant synergies. It also implies that local government must be in the mix, undertaking infrastructure projects at a regional level using local contractors. To give you an example, I want to talk about tunnels. As many of you know, we completed the Waterview Tunnel in 2017, and then we had a hiatus until we started the Central Rail Link project in Auckland in about 2020. At the same time, Watercare announced plans to do their $1.2 billion Central Interceptor Pipe tunnelling project. And of course, we've got the French involved in one project and Italian experts in another project. Now, imagine as a government if we had taken a different approach and gone back and said, look, what we're going to do, and we're going to work alongside these French and Italian experts, and said, what we'll do the Waterview Tunnel, and as soon as we complete that, we will start the Central Rail Loop or link, and then we will follow that with the Waterview Tunnel. Then we'll go down to Wellington and do the tunnelling to fix the transport roads in Wellington, which will inevitably involve some tunnelling under the Basin Reserve. Then we'll go back up to Auckland and we'll do a cross harbour tunnel, and we'll finish it off by doing a tunnel through the Kaimais to better link Tauranga with Hamilton and Auckland. And if, as a government, if we'd said we were going to do this over the next 20 to 30 years and said to those Italian firms, we will guarantee you that work, but the trade-off is that we will need you to work with our New Zealand people, and we want to make sure that they also become world leading. And that is the quid pro quo, and at the same time, we're going to make sure we get the best value for money. That is the type of pipeline we should be talking about as a government. And if we back that up with 20-year funding, then that would have given the certainty and also the expertise and the resourcing to be able to do these large-scale projects. Now, the infrastructure's work around developing a pipeline will go some way towards helping companies assess where the future work is in New Zealand. But I am slightly critical that the Commission hasn't named and shamed those government agencies that have not provided their investment plans to the Commission. I also think that we need to ensure that large council projects are included in this pipeline, and we need to empower the Commission to have the ability to get this information. The other issue is the time to get projects underway in New Zealand. All political parties agree that the RMA needs reform, and this must be a priority. But this is not the only reason for huge delays in progressing projects through the planning process. In the world of infrastructure development, time is something in New Zealand that we seem to treat as a necessary evil, and that any large-scale city-shaping projects ought to take a long period of time, and particularly that the funding and planning stage is actually longer than the design and build stage. The Infrastructure Commission's report to the incoming minister noted that New Zealand is about 46 in terms of competitiveness in terms of doing infrastructure development around the world. We need to change that. The trouble is that large infrastructure projects in New Zealand at the moment take on average about 15 years to complete. Quite simply, we need to unblock that artery if we're to deliver projects at scale and much more quickly. And of course, in infrastructure, as in construction, time is money. Specialists are looking at how we can reduce that time frame from 15 years to 10 years. And of course, it will involve decreasing or reducing the time involved in planning, business case and funding decision-making, consenting, procurement, and of course, the construction and delivery period. We must reduce the time it takes to do large infrastructure projects. Now, when we were in government, National used call-in powers to progress significant projects. My view is that we should start with the proposition that we must build critical infrastructure projects, and then make sure that we are protecting the environmental, cultural, and more important elements, and to make sure they're mitigated as much as necessary. Unfortunately, we currently operate under a framework or a premise where we shouldn't undertake a development. There's a reverse approach to it. Given the significant debt that the government has now got on its books, it is also important that these future infrastructure projects deliver significant, discernible, intergenerational benefits. And I'm not sure that the analysis that we undertake, and in fact, in many cases, large projects are not going through a proper business case assessment. And the other aspect is that in terms of the benefit to cost analysis, I need to question whether in fact it adequately captures the cultural, environmental considerations, and just as importantly, the wider societal benefits that large infrastructure projects deliver. It is interesting in the UK that they never talk about building a road. I spent some time with the infrastructure group as part of the Treasury in the UK. When they talk about doing a new road, they always refer to it as building a new connection, and it was viewed as such. So the issue is, if we build that connection, what is the benefits that we can leverage from that investment to connect businesses, families, or to meet a wider urban planning objective? In terms of New Zealand, we're remiss at this. The classic case is the construction of the new Dunedin Hospital. At 1.5 billion, this is our largest hospital build in New Zealand. Apart from the fact it's taken years to get to the stage of cabinet sign-off of the final business case, the wider issue is that the hospital is seen as a destination in itself. I have a different view. This project should be viewed as a catalyst for change. What we should be doing as a government is that we should be looking at the hospital deficit in New Zealand, in Dunedin, and saying, where are we going to house those 900 workers during the long construction period? We've got housing issues in Dunedin, they're poor, and we've got the Dunedin South issue that will face climate change issues with sea rises over time. Why would we not, as part of that hospital build, be saying to a local private operator, can you build us special purpose houses to house those construction workers? And at the end of the period, we as a government can either take them over as social housing, or we can use them for university purposes. The other blindingly obvious thing is that there will be 900 workers there, and then there'll be over 4,000 health workers once the hospital's up and running. Why isn't the government working with the private sector to say, look, here's a huge commercial opportunity. We will make sure that you can have the ability to construct this and to build the right sort of facilities. And then the third element is one of research and development. I went to a lunch and I listened to a very large pharmaceutical company talking about spending about 20 billion on R&D around the world. And afterwards I said to the New Zealand head, how much of this health R&D are you doing in New Zealand? And they said, well, actually none, even though they do a lot of work in melanoma research. I've now taken that step of talking to the Australian management, but the key thing that came through is that R&D research facilities really value having close connection to clinical hospital workers. So why wouldn't we say to a large R&D company, why don't you build your R&D facilities right beside the hospital and we'll give you the land, but the trade-off will be that we want you here for the next 20 years. And by the way, you might do some research that's really prevalent in New Zealand, like bowel cancer or melanoma. That is the type of stuff we should be doing alongside that hospital. And then why isn't the government going to the council and saying, look, that area around Cadbury site, and many of you have probably been there, it needs to be pedestrianised, it probably needs a different roading layout. So we'd be looking at that project, and the way we should be looking at that project is it is a re-urbanisation of Dunedin. It's probably worth $5 billion. The catalyst was merely the $1.5 billion hospital project. And if we took that perspective, then we'd get much better outcomes rather just than looking at the hospital as a single build on its own. The other thing I want to move on to is around procurement. And this is something I've observed working in the private sector before I came into government, both at the government level and local government level. We procure poorly in New Zealand. We're often too focused on short-term costs and do not adequately assess whole-of-life costs. This means that many of our local suppliers and manufacturers miss out or are disadvantaged when a low-ball bid comes in, when in fact it should be discounted due to the higher maintenance costs of that project over the life of that project. The issue is the lack of expertise of our procurement managers leaves much to be desired. Across government and council agencies, we need to improve the skill set. Most of it is that procurement managers do not adequately understand how risks, or what are the risks, and how to allocate them best to the parties involved. For example, good projects allocate risks such as consenting risks, the operational risks, financing risks to the respective parties that is best able to manage that risk. It is interesting in the UK now, they have had a real focus on upskilling their procurement managers in the civil service. And it now means that if you want to be appointed to a senior procurement role in the government in the UK, you need to be properly trained. This brings me into the next big issue facing the industry, and that is the wider issue of the shortage of skill sets that most operators face. There is a need to continue to train young New Zealanders entering the workforce, and also older New Zealanders who are wanting to retrain into a new vocation. I've got to say much work has been done in this area, and that is to be welcomed. Part of that is to improve diversity in the sector, and we all know the benefits of what that brings. However, the issue about lack of access to talent has been compounded by the government's decision to limit immigration and not to fast track key people through the MIQ. This has made it really difficult for firms, especially where critical staff are required to manage or run big pieces of the machinery. I saw this firsthand when I visited the CRL and the Central Interceptor projects. My personal view is that if you think that 2021 was bad for finding new talent, 2022 will be even worse. And I would say that for three reasons. The first thing is that we've got 160,000 immigrants who have been locked in New Zealand for 480 days, who have not had a visa. And whilst they've been promised it recently by the government, it will take a lot of time until they will be issued their visa. Immigration New Zealand doesn't have that capability. And many of them will leave New Zealand because they're so disenchanted with their treatment they've had. Secondly, we've got the Australians, and in many cases, Canadian firms in here recruiting aggressively. And thirdly, we have trashed our status as a good place to immigrate to. And it's going to take some time for our brand to rebuild. So my big advice to you, if you're an employer of people, make sure you retain the talent that you've got, because it's going to be even more difficult in 22 to be able to access new talent. I now want to move on to the issue of funding and financing. National's open to many different types of funding and financing. And for instance, direct pricing, toll roads, etc., for congestion pricing will be inevitable. Asset recycling, where we sell assets, and Australian governments have certainly been doing that. And then through value capture, and we all know about transport-orientated developments, we should be capturing more of that upside when we're doing these big infrastructure projects. We also believe that the government should be considering the use of infrastructure bonds, and there is a very strong argument for the government to lock in funding now at our current low Treasury and bond rates. Personally, if I was the Minister of Finance, I would be borrowing 20-year money and 30-year money, and I would be setting that aside for long-term infrastructure projects now. During the election, we announced that we would establish an infrastructure bank to better coordinate funding across the entire sector. Such a fund would offer the benefits of first being able to package up funding projects and access larger funds such as sovereign wealth funds to help some projects, which at the moment they don't do with us in New Zealand because of lack of scale. It would also provide a credible investment entity to work with prospective investors, both domestically and internationally. And thirdly, it would have the expertise to implement particular investments. And of course, PPPs are one of those, but it could comprise a whole range of debt, equity and hybrid equity instruments, and draw on various bonds and banking markets. We think that's an important step that we need to move to more efficient funding of our projects. Now, the last thing I want to end, because I want to take some questions, is I want to discuss the issue of water. Providing for the continuing improvement in our water and the resilience of our catchments is a core value for all of us Kiwis. Given the scale of investment by councils, particularly in water and wastewater services, means the government definitely has a role to play in co-investing alongside councils to address these issues. Whilst we support the formation of a water regulator and the need to improve the delivery of water and wastewater services, we do not support the three water proposals. Specifically, we have concerns about the shareholding and governance arrangements and the operational structure. What we do not accept is that governments should what we do accept is that councils should look to amalgamate their operations as much as possible, and central government has a role to help these companies and council operations to meet their lumpy capital expenditure programs. I worked on the water corporatisation and privatisation in England during the 90s for 2.5 years. So I saw what happened during that process to move to more streamlined water and wastewater operations. And I also led the Auckland study of how their council operations should be better managed in Auckland. So I do have an appreciation of the considerations around getting better delivery outcomes for water and wastewater operations. At a higher level, though, I think we're missing a trick. I think that we should be reevaluating the strategic value that we have in terms of water in New Zealand. In fact, if you were to do a strategic analysis of New Zealand, apart from our wonderful people and location and some other advantages, my personal view is that water is one of the most strategic assets that we have in New Zealand, and we collect a mere 2% of it. I think we should be much more strategic about thinking about how we're going to use our water resource in terms of creating new industries. And of course, hydrogen is one such example, and supporting existing industries such as our horticulture industry. This should be a conscious decision. And at present, what we've done is we devolved this decision-making to councils, and I think that's wrong. I think as a country, the government has a role to work alongside the private sector to work out what is the best possible use of this resource and how we might better go about utilising that strategic resource. Ngā mihi nui, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karuna tanga. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much. Now, I'm very keen to take questions.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And we've got quite a few questions coming through, so I think we'll dive right into them. The first one is, how will National fund its ambitious intentions for infrastructure?
Oh, look, I talked about that. We need to make sure that we've got much more strategic funding for infrastructure, and that's why, you know, I talked about the infrastructure bank. But right now, I would be borrowing 20 billion of 20-year money, and probably a similar amount for 30-year money, and locking it in. That's part of the government role, and we should be doing. You know, one of the questions is, if we are going to do these long-term projects, and if I've used that tunnel example, if people have that sight line and also know that the money is there, we're going to get much better outcomes for infrastructure.
Yeah, great, thank you. How would National retain the skills and talents? You mentioned next year is going to be worse. Yeah. How are you going to address that?
Hey, well, this is a short-term and a long-term issue. I'll tell you what, I remember going to see Michelle Kernahan when she was running Fletcher Building, and you know, they did a lot of building during the as part of the consortium during Christchurch. And afterwards, when I went to see her, she said, you know, it's outrageous. We've trained up thousands of people in Christchurch, and we've got all these skill sets, and we are just seeing so many of these people moving to Victoria and New South Wales because we had not put in the pipeline to come up and do other projects up north. We had in Kaikoura, but we had this period where no one had a sightline where to take my staff next, and we just lost so many people. That is because we didn't put in place the steps and the planning, and that's why this pipeline is so essential. And the Infrastructure Commission has a role to play in that in terms of the visibility around it. But central government and councils have a much more important role in making sure that not only do we say what the projects are, but we actually do them and we keep to the timelines. And that again comes back to this big issue about why it takes us so long to do these projects.
Do you think then that the Infrastructure Commission should have more powers?
Well, look, first of all, Infrastructure Commission was a National Party idea. The one thing I am most disappointed, I was involved in the committee stage of setting up the commission. I was very keen that it had an additional role, function, and I got the support of New Zealand First, Greens and ACT. Unfortunately, Labor did not support it, which I think was a real mistake. But that additional power was to give the Infrastructure Commission, as part of its key function, the ability to review not only poor, but good projects in New Zealand so that there were valuable learnings. And I think the Commission actually is slightly hamstrung because it does not have that function. When we get into power, I'm going to pass that and give them greater authority, because I think you've got to empower organisations to do their role, and you also to make sure that there's a stick and carrot to be able to do that, and that's an important role which I think is missing in its remit.
Yeah. Minister Robinson in his talk yesterday said that he was wary of PPPs and clearly not in favour of them. What is yours or National Party's view around PPPs?
Well, I think, and I'm not suggesting this of Grant, although I don't know for sure, but I think many people don't understand PPPs. PPPs should not be called what they're called. They are simply risk-sharing agreements. In fact, when I'm merchant banking days, I always refer to them as risk-sharing agreements. So, and I talked about this a little bit. Everyone focuses on PPPs and saying, oh, the funding arrangements. Well, actually, no, they're not. In many cases, funding arrangements are best managed through by government. But PPPs are great where you're looking at operational risks. If you're doing a tunnel, who's going to take, or like my old firm did 2 business cases for the Penlink road crossing going up to Whangapara. Now, that was a classic case of which would have been appropriate for a PPP, although it's a very small project, but there was interest at the time because how many cars will literally cross that bridge? And if you want to co-fund it using an operator, how you separate that risk from the consenting risks, of course there's the district council involved back then, all those types of risks need to be allocated. And that's what PPPs are about. Unfortunately, we've had poor experience in New Zealand, but we've got to get it right, partly because I think in Maine, we have people literally, when they're doing the negotiations, don't understand them properly, but they do have a role to play. But I'm not going to suggest to you that they're the only role to play. They are one, and I talked about value capture. I think the biggest issue, and I did a review for Ministry of Transport when we were doing the CRL original proposal, we missed the opportunity to get a significant amount of the value capture out of the Central Rail Loop. And it was appalling waste because, that project's now going to be nearly 4 billion, if not more, when it completes. We could have actually worked with the private sector and local operators to actually capture and probably got large amounts of the 3 train stations paid for by people who are going to benefit.
What do you think causes all these infrastructure delays in New Zealand? What do you think the sticking point is?
Well, I talked about it, and this is why I wanted to. It was quite a long speech there. Look, there's no single fix to infrastructure. In my view, we've got a systemic issue, and the biggest issue I think is the lack of pipeline. Because if I talk about Auckland again. We had the Auckland Transport Alignment Program, ATAP. Bill English negotiated with Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore, and then, which is, everyone knows about a 10 and longer term plan, right? So it gave visibility to people. And then we had a change of government, and unfortunately, and governments to some extent should have some discretion, but I think what we lost out of the new ATAP is we actually end up doing a total re-evaluation of it. And so we lost strategic networks like the Mill Road connection coming down to Papakura, which I did a business case for national green to it. So so we've got, we need to create pipelines, and the point of that comment was we need to stick to them. The second thing was we need to procure them properly and fairly and work out, if we're working with these companies, and this is where we need local companies involved as well, not just the big players, we need you to do lots of projects, not just burn you off in the first project and think we got a good deal. We actually need to do many of them. And then we need to make sure we speed up our planning and processes. They're appallingly slow. And then we need to make sure we've got the funding alongside. There's a whole step change that's required. And this is when I said at the start, I don't think we've got the institutional arrangements right in New Zealand. And that's why 15 years is outrageous. I'll tell you what, we built the, under National, we consented and built the motorway north of Auckland, north of Wellington, Peka one within 5 years. It was an outstanding effort. We should be doing more of that.
Yeah. Great. Can you share some of the examples that National, you mentioned about critical infrastructure, but can you give some of those examples of what you would deem would be critical infrastructure?
Oh, look, if you look at government's activities, there's a whole stack of them. But the first thing is the transport link. I think it's appalling that mums and dads are spending a lot of time on Saturday morning traveling across cities trying to get to the sports fields with their kids, right? So there are certain strategic road links that need to be completed. But if you go back to Auckland, it's quite clear what they are. We're going out to the west. We need bus or train going out to the west along Western Motorway. We need the southern link. Once you get to Manukau, we've got one motorway south. We need a dual alternative route. That's what Mill Road was about, but I think we probably lost that opportunity. We've got poor servicing out to the east of Auckland. Sorry if I'm focusing on Auckland. So that'll be train. So integrated train, road, and cycleways and walkways are all part of that. that's one area. Digital, I'm very keen that National did the broadband rollout and the RBI, Rural Broadband Initiative. We need to complete the job. And personally, and I wrote a report 3 days into the first lockdown of COVID back March last year. In it, I said we need to upgrade and finish our digital connectivity. If I was the minister now, I would have put money into that, because we've still got poor connectivity in rural areas and in rural areas, if I can use that differentiation, and it's not right. You know, farmers are very sophisticated now in the way they manage their entities. Then we go across, you know, it depends if you're, you know, prisons are important, and we need to make sure we've got the proper infrastructure for them. We've got some very critical defence that, and from a national, say New Zealand national perspective, we need to complete. We've got the Ohakea bill going on right now, which is a major project. So, you know, there's all these things, and we just, in terms of those, some of those we just need to do quickly.
No, great, thank you. How will you ensure that the projects that you've mentioned, or even other future projects, will not have any significant adverse effects on the environment, so that they are sustainable?
Hey, well, this is part of the RMA reform, and look, just be quite upfront. It is important that we protect environmental aspects and the wider benefits, or wider aspects of what it means for communities. But as I said, actually, I think in many cases we undervalue the societal benefits of that, and I'm not sure the cost-benefit analysis actually picks up adequately whether, in fact, those wider benefits are actually being taken into account. But yeah, look, the whole reason around the RMA reform is that we've built up all this case law, and what we were proposing is that we have one act which empowers development and investment, and on the other side has a piece of legislation that takes into account the environmental, climate change, cultural aspects, all that. And that's a good tension, right? We need to have the tension. But the reason why, what I was trying to say before, we've almost got to a point where we think about an idea, and then, oh, everything else, all the other considerations are so difficult that we can't do the project. Well, actually, in some critical stuff, we actually need to do the project, and the emphasis should be on how can we mitigate those society, community, and environmental aspects to make sure we get the right outcome. So, you know, it's a balance. I'm not trying to say just do projects and don't worry about the environmental outcomes. That's absolutely wrong. But we do need to have a change which is saying we do need to build critical infrastructure, and we need to do it quickly.
Yeah. How would you ensure that the pipeline survives changes in governments? Yeah,
this is a bit of a tension, isn't it? Well, the first thing is, in a wider context, I think we need to have the council and government programs all in one. And I'm looking forward to the day that the Infrastructure Commission actually has a really good plan. I've been through the projects. It's a start, but it's got a long way to go. And I don't think it works in themes. So if I think the way we lay that out needs to be where construction firms, like if you're a tunnelling specialist, you'd be able to see what your line of sight is around future projects. But look, I think, and I made this point, many of large projects have not been subject to a proper cost-benefit analysis, and the Infrastructure Commission notes that in its report. If I want to be political for a moment, the $800 million bridge across the Auckland Harbour was a shocker. That did not have a benefit cost analysis, and there have been a number of projects where literally, I think and this, I suppose, comes back to the role of Waka Kotahi in this, and I am worried about the undue influence that's happening now, because there needs to be a tension between government and our organisations, our government agencies, who should be the experts, and that's why I think making sure that cost-benefit analysis, proper assessment is undertaken. If a government wants to make a decision on top of that, that should be an explicit decision that they have not done that, and they're doing it for other reasons. But you know, there's so many examples I can talk about. I don't want to be overly political about this, but I think we've ended up, you know, even in the shovel-ready projects, which are low-value projects, $3 billion worth, which is actually quite a significant sum of money.
Brilliant. Here's another question. Thanks for your address, Andrew. National has previously, while in government, underinvested in key infrastructure, which has included delay in maintenance and renewals, and also not funding some new ones. Can we have an undertaking that that won't happen again if National comes back into power, and that it will stick to the National Infrastructure Priority List?
Yeah, look, that criticism, you know, how times change. You know, when we had the Christchurch earthquake, that cost 19 billion. And, you know, we ran deficits for 3 years and to try and get our books back into shape. And we had a strong view that debt should be down to 20% of GDP, which is where we're driving it. Fast forward to now, and current debt is 33% and projected to go to 48% of GDP. And we've spent 62 billion on a COVID fund, and much of it, as the Auditor General highlighted the other day, of not being transparent. And we think that's fine. And we just somehow got used to spending grants, just requested another 7 billion for the COVID fund. And we just think that's okay. So, and looking back in time, we were ruthlessly focused on getting the financial state of the books of the government into a good shape. And in hindsight, we're probably overly fixated on that. And that meant that we didn't do a lot of infrastructure spend. It didn't mean that we didn't want to do it. We just took a different perspective on it. Look, I'm not proposing that we go out and have a massive spend up. My biggest job I'm going to have if I'm future Minister of Finance is how we deal with that debt. But we need to make sure we are spending significant sums of money. But I think the other issue is actually if you look at the actual infrastructure spend at the moment, it's very lumpy, and we haven't got continuity. We have projects cancelled. Look, Mill Road was we announced in 2017. Government said no, they're not going to do it. Then they said they're going to do it. Now they're saying they're not going to do it. You know, that's just shambolic. Yeah. So as a government, we won't be doing that. I'll be absolutely fixated on delivering projects, and lots of them, one after another. The biggest issue we'll probably have is capacity of the industry, which is the one I noted before. And that's why we need to have more provincial firms involved in a lot of these projects. But yeah, bottom line, definitely we will spend it. We are a party of infrastructure spend. And I look at these strategic, you know, they're investments. They're not things we cost. They're investments for the future of New Zealanders.
This is one topic that's quite passionate to me, and you mentioned on it in your speech, and we've got a session on it this afternoon. But what will National do to improve diversity in the sector? Oh,
look, I noted this, you know, and I think the government, this is where I would applaud the government and the work of the group of companies led by Peter Reedy around improving the workforce. Look, we do need diversity. You know, we all know, I have a business where I've got lots of trucks and all that sort of stuff. And we all know that, women drivers are normally much better in terms of maintenance and looking after the machinery. And that's not to say guys are not good, but, you know, in the main, they are much more protective of the machinery and all that sort of stuff. And they have different skill sets. Then, you know, the involvement in Māori and Pacifica and all that sort of stuff, it all brings diversity to the workforce. So, and then of course we've got lots of new immigrants into New Zealand. So it's pretty self-evident of the need to diversify and bring diversity, particularly in what was traditionally seen as very much a man's world. And, you know, I've seen it firsthand in business I've been involved in. So you don't need to oversell me on that.
Great, thank you. And that's our last question, Andrew. So I really appreciate your time with us this morning.
Hey, thanks, Claire. It's been wonderful, and I hope viewers have got something out of that.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Well, that's the end of this session. We do have a bit of a break now till 11 o'clock where we've got Minister Wood going to speak on transport. Unfortunately, his flight has been delayed, but we did do a pre-record with him 2 days ago on Tuesday. So we're going to play the pre-record and then he's going to doing the Q&A from the airport when he lands. So join back here at 11 o'clock. Thank you.